in a small town nestled deep within the rugged mountains of Colombia, there lies a place that sends a chill down the spine of every local. It's a place so feared that people refuse to even speak of it. Known as La Casa de la Muerte, or the House of Death, it's a mansion with a dark past that lingers over the town like an ominous cloud. The house itself is a crumbling, eerie structure, half hidden by the overgrowth of the thick jungle surrounding it. Its once grand walls are now covered in creeping vines, and its windows, though shattered, still seem to watch the town with an unsettling stare. For generations, La Casa de la Muerte has been the subject of hushed whispers, a tale passed from elder to child, a warning for anyone brave enough or foolish enough to venture too close. The origins of La Casa de la Muerte are lost to time, buried under the weight of stories that are more nightmare than truth. It was once the home of the Larios family, a wealthy and influential family in the town, known for their sprawling estate and luxurious lifestyle. They were the kind of people whose name was spoken with reverence, their wealth and power reaching into every corner of the town. But then, one night, everything changed. The family mysteriously vanished without a trace, leaving behind only an abandoned house that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. At first, the disappearance of the Larios family was treated like any other tragedy in a small town. People talked about it, made their own speculations, and tried to move on. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, strange occurrences began to surround the house. The locals claimed that at night they could see flickers of light from the windows, as if someone was moving inside. But when they went to check, the house was always silent, abandoned, and cold. Then came the first real sign of something wrong, the sound of footsteps in the dirt driveway. But when people investigated, no one was there. Despite these unsettling events, the house stood untouched, a grim reminder of the Larios family's sudden disappearance. Over time, the whispers grew louder. The house became the subject of urban legends, stories passed down to children as warnings to stay away. Some said the Larios family had been cursed by a powerful spirit, a vengeance that had followed them to their grave. Others whispered about a ritual gone horribly wrong, one that had cost the family their lives and damned the house forever. One of the more popular rumors was that the family had made a pact with a mysterious figure, a person or entity whose identity was never clear. This entity, some said, had granted the Larios family unimaginable wealth, but in return, they had to sacrifice something far more precious: their souls. In the dead of night, when the moon was hidden behind dark clouds, the house was said to become a vessel for dark forces, a place where rituals of blood and bone were carried out to maintain the family's wealth and power. But these stories were never confirmed. They were merely the twisted imaginations of people desperate to explain what had happened. One thing, however, was certain. The Larios family had vanished, and the house they left behind became something far darker than it had ever been. People who ventured too close to the property began to vanish, and those who returned spoke of strange visions and haunting experiences. The air in and around La Casa de la Muerte felt heavy, as though the very earth itself was cursed. It wasn't just that people went missing. It was what happened to them afterward that made everyone even more afraid. Some who had entered the house and come back alive were not quite themselves. They seemed to have lost their sense of time, their minds clouded with confusion. Others were more disturbing. They seemed to age overnight, their faces drawn and hollow, their eyes distant, as if they had seen something that had broken them beyond repair. They would mutter about the horrors they had witnessed inside the house, though no one could ever make sense of their words. It was as if the house had taken a piece of their soul, and they were left wandering the town as mere shadows of the people they had once been. Even the bravest of souls had stopped daring to explore La Casa de la Muerte. It was said that any person who spent too much time near the house would eventually begin to feel its pull. The house wasn't just a building. It was something much darker, an ancient force that grew stronger with every passing year. It thrived on fear, on the terror of those who dared to approach. The once beautiful mansion, with its grand staircases and polished wood, had become a twisted version of itself. The very foundation seemed to groan with the weight of the evil that had taken root inside. As the years passed, the story of La Casa de la Muerte became more of a myth than a reality. New generations grew up hearing only the rumors, the warnings, but many dismissed them as just that, stories meant to scare children. But no one would ever truly test those rumors. The fear was too real, too ingrained in the fabric of the town. Those who were brave enough to ask about it were always met with stern looks and quiet refusals. It was as if the people were too afraid to speak of the house, as if saying its name out loud might summon whatever dark force still lurked there. Despite the fear that surrounded it, La Casa de la Muerte had its share of visitors. A few reckless teenagers, driven by curiosity and the desire to prove they weren't afraid, would often sneak into the house at night, armed with nothing more than their smartphones and a sense of invincibility. They'd take pictures, film videos, and laugh off the eerie sounds and strange feelings that crept up on them the longer they stayed. But as the hours passed, that laughter would fade, replaced by the unmistakable tension that hung in the air. Something about La Casa de la Muerte wasn't right, and even the most daring of explorers couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Some of these teens returned, though their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror. They would never speak of what they saw inside, but they would warn others to stay away. Others never returned at all. The town would whisper about their disappearances, but no one would go searching for them. The house had claimed them, just like it had claimed so many others. Over time, the house grew more distant from the town, swallowed by the encroaching jungle. The roads leading to it were overgrown, and the area surrounding it became too dangerous to traverse. But even though the house was slowly being reclaimed by nature, its reputation remained untarnished. It still stood, looming in the distance, as a reminder of the darkness that had once inhabited it. To this day, no one dares to venture close to La Casa de la Muerte. The town may have forgotten some of the details, but the fear remains. The house is still there, waiting, and the rumors, the legends, and the chilling whispers live on in the hearts of those who have been touched by its curse. Some say that the house is still hungry, that it waits for the next soul to wander too close, to be taken, never to be seen again. Others believe that it is forever bound to the land, its evil etched into the very soil. But whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain: La Casa de la Muerte will never be forgotten, and the terror it inspires will last for generations to come. The night had fallen quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the breeze. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town of Santa Teresa. The air was cool, carrying a sense of anticipation. Alex, Maria, and Carlos, the trio of friends who had grown up hearing the unsettling stories of La Casa de la Muerte, had finally decided it was time to uncover the truth. They had heard the whispers, the rumors, and the warnings for years, and to be honest, they were growing tired of them. They wanted to see it with their own eyes, to experience whatever it was that had made the house so feared. Armed with little more than flashlights, a bag of snacks, and far too much bravado, they stood at the edge of the jungle that led to the infamous house. Alex, the de facto leader of the group, adjusted his backpack and grinned nervously. Tonight, we're going to end the mystery. We're going in. Maria rolled her eyes, but couldn't help feeling the twinge of excitement that came with the challenge. Right, and when we end up regretting this, you'll be the first one I blame. Carlos, the most reluctant of the trio, stood at the back, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Are we sure we should do this? I mean, we've all heard what happens to people who go inside. But the group had made their decision, and there was no turning back now. After all, it was just an old house, right? A broken-down relic of a long-forgotten past. How could it be so terrifying? They took their first steps into the jungle, the path barely visible through the dense foliage. The trees creaked and groaned as though they were alive, whispering secrets that only the wind could understand. The further they ventured, the colder the air seemed to grow, as if the very temperature of the night was being stolen by something unseen. Maria pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. As they walked deeper into the jungle, the sound of their footsteps seemed to blend with the eerie rustling of leaves, almost as if the jungle itself was trying to hide the fact that they were there. It felt as though the ground beneath their feet was sucking them in, the weight of the forest growing heavier with every step. When they finally reached the edge of the clearing, La Casa de la Muerte loomed before them. The house was nothing like they had expected. It stood there, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, with its jagged roofline and cracked, broken windows staring back at them like hollow eyes. The once grand structure now seemed warped, as though it had been twisted by the years and the dark forces that had claimed it. It was a decaying monument to something terrible, something that no one could understand. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the house. It looked like a place out of a nightmare. But Alex, ever the daring one, gave her a playful shove. Come on, let's go inside and finally see what all the fuss is about. Carlos, who had been silent for the past few minutes, shook his head. I don't know, man. It's one thing to stand out here looking at it. It's another to go inside. His voice wavered with uncertainty. But Alex just laughed. Stop being such a baby. You've heard the stories too. Let's prove them wrong. Reluctantly, Carlos followed them as they crossed the overgrown yard and made their way toward the front gate. The old iron gate creaked loudly as Alex pushed it open, the sound echoing through the night. It felt like the gate itself was warning them, begging them to turn back. But they didn't listen. "See? Nothing to worry about," Alex said, his voice a little too loud in the silence that surrounded them. "Now, let's get inside." They approached the front door, which stood slightly ajar, as if inviting them to enter. The wooden door was weathered and warped, the paint peeling off in places, revealing the dark wood beneath. The house seemed to breathe in the night, its presence overwhelming in its stillness. Alex reached out, pushing the door open further, the hinges groaning in protest. Maria hesitated. What if someone's still living here? What if it's not just empty? "Who would want to live in this place?" Alex replied with a chuckle. "It's just an old abandoned house. Now come on, let's see what's inside." He stepped forward, and with a glance at Carlos, who reluctantly followed, they crossed the threshold into the dark interior. The moment they entered, the temperature dropped even further, making their breaths visible in the cold air. The smell of mold and decay filled their nostrils, and the silence was almost suffocating. Alex shone his flashlight around the room. It was a grand entryway, or at least it had been once. The faded wallpaper clung to the walls, and the grand staircase that once spiraled up to the second floor was now a shadow of its former self, the wood worn down by time. Dust floated in the air, catching the beam of their flashlights. Everything was still, untouched by time, but burdened by it. Alex, ever the skeptic, waved her off. "It's just an old house. Let's explore a little. We'll be out in no time." They began to move further into the house, exploring each room as they went. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper. The house seemed to stretch on forever, and the more they walked, the more it felt like they were being swallowed by it. Carlos was the first to break the silence. "Do you guys hear that?" Alex and Maria stopped, looking at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" Maria asked. Carlos was already looking around, his flashlight bouncing off the walls. "It's like whispering, coming from upstairs." Maria's heart skipped a beat. "There's no one else here." Alex's confidence wavered, but he pushed it down. "It's just the house settling. Nothing to worry about." But even he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As they moved toward the staircase, the house seemed to groan beneath their feet. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows felt as though they were moving. They climbed the stairs cautiously, each step echoing through the empty house. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was as if someone, or something, was beckoning them forward. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before them, lined with closed doors. The whispers seemed to come from behind one of them, but they couldn't tell which one. Maria took a deep breath, her fear growing with each passing second. "Do we really want to keep going?" she asked, her voice shaky. Alex, though visibly unsettled, nodded. "We've come this far. Let's just see what's going on." And so, with their hearts pounding in their chests, they continued deeper into the house, drawn by the mystery and the whispers that seemed to echo from the very walls themselves. The truth they sought was just ahead, and no matter how much they feared it, They couldn't turn back now. The door creaked closed behind them, with a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Alex, Maria, and Carlos stood in the entryway, the weight of the house pressing down on them. The air inside was thick, heavy with an oppressive feeling that made every breath feel more labored than the last. The chill that swept through their bodies was no longer just from the cold. It was something deeper, something that settled into their bones and lingered like a persistent shadow. As they ventured deeper into the house, the light from their flashlights barely cut through the darkness. The floors creaked under their feet, each step sounding far too loud in the quiet, as if the house itself was groaning in discomfort. The walls were covered in patches of mold, and the air carried the unmistakable scent of decay. There were thick cobwebs in every corner, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the empty halls, as if something was alive within the walls, waiting, watching. Maria's hand trembled as she adjusted the beam of her flashlight, casting a jittery glow across the room. The ancient wallpaper peeled away in large strips, revealing the rotting wood beneath. The furniture was covered in layers of dust, their once sleek surfaces now warped and sagging under the weight of time. Every piece seemed frozen in a moment long forgotten, as though the house had been abandoned suddenly and no one had dared to return. "Let's just look around and get out," Maria suggested, her voice shaking with uncertainty. "We'll be fine." Her words were meant to reassure herself as much as them, but deep down, she didn't believe it. The house felt alive, like it was breathing, its pulse in time with the dripping water that echoed in the distance. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Carlos didn't respond immediately. His eyes, wide with nervous energy, darted around the room, unable to focus on any one thing for too long. The darkness seemed to stretch out at the edges of the flashlight's beam, as if it were trying to pull them in. Carlos finally nodded, but it was more out of habit than belief. "Yeah, sure, we just need to get this over with." They moved further into the house, each step carrying them deeper into its eerie silence. The hallways grew narrower, and the temperature dropped even more, the air thick with a dampness that clung to their skin. Every corner they turned seemed to lead them to another dark room that stretched further into the unknown. The once grand staircase they had noticed earlier loomed behind them, now just an ominous shadow. They came to a large sitting room, its grand fireplace filled with only the remnants of ash and dust. Once, it might have been a place for laughter, for family gatherings, for warmth. Now, it was nothing more than a hollowed-out shell of memories. The windows, covered in grime, allowed only slivers of moonlight to filter through, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The furniture, an old, tattered couch and a few chairs, looked like they had been abandoned mid-use, as though the family who had lived there had left without a word, never to return. Maria ran her fingers along the back of one of the chairs, the fabric coming apart under her touch. Her flashlight flickered for a moment, casting the room into complete darkness before it came back on. For a brief instant, she thought she saw something move in the far corner, something quick and fleeting, just out of the edge of the light. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just the shadows playing tricks on her. "Let's keep moving," Alex said, his voice low but firm, as if trying to push past the unease settling in his chest. He motioned toward the hallway on the other side of the room, his flashlight cutting through the darkness in front of them. "We'll check the rest of the house and then leave." Carlos didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on the far end of the room. His breath came in shallow gasps, his grip tightening on the flashlight as if he were trying to steady himself. "I don't know, man," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "This place is wrong." But Alex, ever the skeptic, pushed forward, eager to get this over with. He moved to the hallway, with Maria and Carlos reluctantly following. Each room they passed seemed colder, darker, as if the very walls were closing in on them. They felt like they were being swallowed whole, and every step felt heavier than the last. Then it happened. A sound, a sharp, echoing slam, broke the silence, coming from somewhere deep in the house. The sound of a door being forcefully shut, as though someone or something was trying to keep them out. It rattled the very core of their being, sending a shock of adrenaline through their veins. For a moment, no one moved, as if they were all frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. Maria's heart raced in her chest, the sound of her own breath suddenly too loud in her ears. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thudding of her heart. Alex, trying to appear unfazed, held up his flashlight. "It's nothing. Probably just the house settling." But even as he said the words, the doubt crept in. The slam had been too sharp, too deliberate, to be just a creaking door. He looked at Carlos, who was staring down the hallway, his eyes wide with terror. Carlos was pale, his hand trembling as he held his flashlight, his gaze fixed on the source of the sound. It was coming from the far end of the house. "Maybe we should go," Carlos said, his voice cracking as fear began to take over. "This isn't just an old house. Something's here. We need to leave now." Maria, equally shaken, looked at Alex. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, but he was still holding on to the bravado that had led them here in the first place. He had always been the fearless one, but now it seemed like the fear was contagious. "We can't just leave now," Alex said, but even his voice lacked the confidence it had moments ago. "We came this far. Let's just see what it is. We're already here." Maria opened her mouth to protest, but couldn't find the words. Every instinct inside her screamed to turn and run, but she couldn't. The house was too powerful, its grip on them too strong. They continued down the hall, the shadows seeming to grow darker with every step. The door from which the sound had come was just ahead. Alex reached for the doorknob, and as his fingers brushed against it, he felt a strange vibration run through the metal, as if the house was alive, reacting to their presence. He hesitated for a split second, a brief moment of doubt flashing across his face, but with a deep breath, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black. No light, no sound. Only the oppressive weight of the air around them. They stepped into the room, and immediately the door slammed shut behind them. The room felt suffocating, like it was pushing in from all sides. The walls were covered in something dark, almost slick, and the air smelled faintly of rot. The air was still, yet somehow alive with tension. It was then that they realized they weren't alone. A moment, the soft whisper reached their ears. It was as if the very air had changed. It was subtle at first, barely a murmur. But as it lingered in the silence of the house, it grew louder, becoming more distinct. At first, it was a voice so soft it might have been the wind, or the house itself creaking in the night. But then it started to take shape. A sound, a murmur, then words that were almost too faint to catch. And then it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a voice, urgent and desperate, rising from the floorboards above them, echoing through the cold, empty house. Alex's heart skipped a beat. His pulse quickened. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. The others were still, their bodies frozen in place as they listened to the faint, broken sounds floating down the stairs. The voice was pleading, weak, but unmistakable. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a call for help. Maria looked around, her eyes wide with panic. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight. "Who's there?" she asked, but her voice trembled, the question not entirely leaving her lips as a command, but as a question to the void. No response came, only the persistent hum of the silence that followed. Carlos was the first to break the stillness. He stepped back a little, shaking his head. "It's just the house. The wind, maybe. It's nothing." But his words were weak, and even he didn't believe them. He was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. The fear was creeping in, and it had begun to suffocate the bravado that had led them here in the first place. "No," Alex said, his voice lower now, filled with the unease he had tried to hide before. His grip on his flashlight tightened. "This isn't the wind. There's something up there." His heart was pounding, the sensation of being watched growing heavier with every passing second. Without thinking, Alex took a step forward, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the darkened hallway. "We have to see what it is," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of fear and determination. He was the one who had insisted on coming this far. Now there was no turning back. Slowly, and with trepidation creeping into their every movement, they made their way toward the stairs. The groaning of the house beneath their feet seemed to echo around them, each step heavier than the last. It was as if the very structure of the house was alive, breathing with them, groaning with their every movement. The house seemed to grow darker as they ascended, the shadows stretching longer, wrapping around them like cold fingers, pulling them toward whatever waited at the top. Each step they took seemed to amplify the voice, growing louder and more distinct. The whisper that had once been barely audible was now clear, and the words it carried were chilling. "Help me, help me." It was the voice of someone desperate, someone trapped, someone begging for release. The voice was faint, but the urgency behind it was unmistakable, the kind of voice that could stir a deep, primal fear. Maria swallowed hard, but her body felt frozen, like her feet were cemented to the steps. She glanced at Carlos, who was trailing behind her. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around the darkened hall, trying to find something, anything, to explain what was happening. But there was nothing, just the sound of the voice, growing stronger the closer they got. Alex was the first to reach the top of the stairs, his breath coming out in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with fear. He turned and glanced at the hallway stretching out before them. The air was colder up here, and the house felt even more alive, as though it had drawn them in, feeding off their fear. The voice was louder now, coming from somewhere just ahead of them. It was clearer, but more desperate than ever. "Please, help me." Alex's eyes were fixed on a door at the end of the hallway, the last one on the left. There was no reason for him to be drawn to it, no rational explanation for the pull he felt toward it. But something inside him told him that the voice was coming from behind that door. Without a word, he moved toward it, the others following closely behind, their footsteps now muted against the thick carpet that lined the hallway. With each step, the house seemed to grow colder, and the air grew thicker, pressing down on them, making it harder to breathe. Alex reached for the doorknob, his fingers trembling as he touched the cold metal. The house seemed to hold its breath. Even the voices, which had been so loud just moments before, now seemed to pause, hanging in the air with a palpable tension. Alex hesitated for a second, his heart racing. The fear that had been gnawing at him since they first entered the house seemed to peak now. But there was no going back. With a sharp intake of breath, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing down the hallway like a final warning. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, the beam from their flashlights revealing nothing but dust-covered furniture and faded wallpaper. The silence was deafening. The air inside the room felt stale, as if it had not been disturbed in years. For a long moment, they stood there in the doorway, the flashlight beams dancing over the empty space. There was no one inside, no sign of life, no one to answer the desperate pleas they had heard only moments ago. It was just an empty room. But then, as the light swept over the far wall, they saw it. Written in what looked like dark, dried blood was a message, scrawled hastily, as if whoever had written it was running out of time, or sanity. The words were simple, but the impact was chilling. "They never leave. You won't either." The room seemed to shrink as the words burned themselves into their minds. A cold shiver ran down Alex's spine, and he felt as if the walls of the house were closing in on him, surrounding him, trapping him inside. He took an involuntary step back, his legs suddenly feeling weak beneath him. Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Carlos stood frozen, his face drained of color, his mouth dry. They had all heard the stories, but this felt different. This wasn't just a haunted house. This was something far worse, something alive. "What the hell does that mean?" Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. Her breath came in shallow bursts, and she clutched her flashlight tightly in her hand. Alex didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. The words on the wall were all he could focus on, the meaning behind them gnawing at his mind. "They never leave. You won't either." What did it mean? Who had written this? And why? But before he could voice his thoughts, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. The air grew colder, more suffocating. The very atmosphere seemed to press against them, pushing them back, urging them to leave. And yet, it was as if something was holding them there, keeping them from escaping. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, and the house seemed to shake with the force. The three of them jumped, their bodies rigid with terror. The voices, the whispers, started again, this time louder than ever before, echoing through the walls. "You will never leave," they seemed to chant, their voices blending into a symphony of despair. The walls, the ceiling, the very house itself seemed to come alive, feeding on their fear, responding to their panic. Alex's heart raced, and his breath quickened. They had to get out. They had to leave before whatever was haunting this place claimed them too. But the door was locked. They couldn't get out, and as the voices continued to fill the room, growing more desperate, more frantic, Alex realized with a sickening certainty that they were trapped. They had stepped into something far darker than they had ever imagined, and there was no way out. As Alex, Maria, and Carlos stood there, staring at the bloodstained message on the wall, something shifted in the air. The cold that had settled over them moments before deepened, becoming unbearable. It was as though the very temperature of the room had dropped by several degrees in a split second, and their breath became visible, puffing out in front of them like they were standing in the middle of a freezer. The chill crawled under their skin, sinking into their bones, and for a moment, it felt as if they were no longer in the same place. The house, with its decaying walls and broken windows, seemed to have become a living, breathing thing, and it was suffocating them. Then, without warning, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. The sound was so sharp and sudden that it made them all jump, their hearts racing. It was as if the house itself had recoiled, reacting to their intrusion, warning them to leave. Maria's hand flew to her mouth in terror, and Alex spun toward the source of the noise, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The door behind them slammed shut with a deafening thud, the force of it shaking the entire room. The sound reverberated in their ears, sending a wave of panic through their bodies. They were trapped. The walls closed in on them, the air growing denser with every second. The flashlight flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the walls like something alive, something watching them. "Shit," Alex cursed under his breath, trying to shake the flashlight back to life. His heart was hammering in his chest as he fumbled with the switch, his hands shaking uncontrollably. But no matter how much he tried, the light refused to steady, flickering wildly as if it were on the brink of dying. He could hear his breath coming faster, feel the panic creeping up from the pit of his stomach. He had to get the light working. They couldn't be in the dark in this place. Finally, with a sharp flick, the light snapped back on, and for a brief second, Alex thought they were safe. But as the beam of light swept across the room, his heart froze in his chest. What he saw made his stomach lurch and his blood run cold. The walls were covered in blood. It wasn't just a stain or a smudge. No, this was different. The blood was dripping, slowly, methodically, like it was fresh. It ran down the walls in thick rivulets, pooling at the baseboards, staining the floor in a dark, viscous mess. The light caught the edges of the blood, making it glisten in the beam, and for a moment, it almost looked like it was alive, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. Maria gasped, her scream catching in her throat as she took a step back, but then her eyes locked onto the floor. "Alex, look!" she cried out in horror, her voice breaking. She pointed toward the center of the room, where a massive pool of blood had gathered. It was bigger than anything they had ever seen, darker than anything their minds could comprehend. The blood pooled like a river, flowing from the walls, the ceiling, the very foundation of the house, until it seemed to take on a life of its own, spreading across the floor in an almost deliberate pattern. Carlos turned pale, his face draining of color. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. He backed away from the center of the room, his eyes wide with panic. "We need to leave. Now." Maria was already backing toward the door, but as she grabbed the doorknob, she yanked her hand away in shock. "It's locked," she screamed. She pulled at it again, harder this time, but it wouldn't budge. The door, which had opened so easily before, was now sealed shut, as though someone was on the other side, holding it closed, trapping them inside. Alex rushed to the door, his pulse racing. He grabbed the doorknob with both hands and twisted it with all his strength, but it wouldn't turn. The blood continued to pour from the walls, the ceiling, and even the floor, as if the house itself was alive, feeding on their fear, growing stronger with each passing second. The room felt heavier now, suffocating, like they were caught in a nightmare with no way out. "Please, please," Maria begged, her voice desperate as she banged on the door, her knuckles bruising from the force. "Let us out! We need to get out of here!" But the door remained firmly shut. The blood continued to flow, its steady stream a chilling reminder of their helplessness. The room was no longer just a place. It had become something else. The house, the blood, the very air around them. It was like they were trapped in some kind of twisted, living organism. A force that could not be reasoned with or escaped from. Alex's mind raced. What the hell was happening? Was this some kind of prank? But no one would do this. No one could create this kind of horror. It wasn't real, was it? The walls were slick with blood. The floor was soaked in it. And it was real. It was happening. And they were trapped in the middle of it, unable to break free. "Help me," Carlos suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with fear. He had taken a few steps back, but now he was kneeling down, his hands pressed against his face, like he was trying to block out the sight. He was shaking, unable to process what was happening around him. "This isn't real. This can't be happening." Maria, her eyes wide with terror, stood frozen, unable to move. The blood had begun to spread faster, reaching her feet, the cold, slick liquid seeping through her shoes and chilling her to the bone. The stench of decay filled her nostrils, making her stomach churn. "We need to go. Now," she insisted, her voice trembling as she grabbed at Alex's arm, tugging at him to move. "Please, Alex. I can't stay here." But Alex, still staring at the blood, his heart hammering in his chest, wasn't listening. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. How was it possible? How could this have happened? This wasn't normal. There was no way this was natural. The blood continued to pour, and now it wasn't just dripping. It was flowing, rushing out of the walls, the ceiling, even the floorboards, like a river trapped inside the house. The room was quickly becoming submerged in it. The once dry carpet, now a murky crimson flood that lapped at their ankles. "Alex, we have to go!" Maria screamed again, her voice filled with panic. But it was like her words were lost in the chaos. The door was still locked. The house was still alive, and the blood was everywhere, rising faster than they could move. In that moment, Alex knew. They weren't just in a haunted house. This wasn't some supernatural joke. The house was feeding on them. It was alive. It had been alive for years, for generations, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The blood was proof of that. It wasn't just from the walls. It was from them. Their fear, their terror, was what had awakened it, and now it was claiming them.
Alex's mind snapped into focus. "We're not gonna make it," he whispered, his voice a hollow echo in the blood-soaked room. And in that moment, he realized the truth. They had never been meant to leave. The house had claimed them long ago. They just hadn't known it yet. The air was thick with dread. The once faint whispers, barely audible in the shadows, had transformed into something far worse. Agonizing wails that seemed to reverberate through the walls of La Casa de la Muerte. The sound filled their ears, a deafening chorus of voices crying out in pain. Their anguish so deep it felt as if it was tearing through their very souls. The house seemed to be alive, pulsating with the suffering of its past inhabitants, their torment echoing in every corner. The walls, once solid and unmoving, now seemed to press in on them, closing in tighter with every passing second, as though the house itself was slowly but surely swallowing them whole. Alex's breath was ragged, his chest tight with fear. The wailing grew louder, the cries of pain melding into one endless, torturous sound that scraped against his mind. Maria was at his side, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She was clutching her arms, her fingers digging into her skin as if trying to hold herself together, but finding none. They were trapped. The house itself seemed to be alive, its groans and creaks like the suffering of an ancient being. The air was thick, suffocating, and the temperature had dropped further. They could see their breath, the mist of it, hanging in the air like a cloud of despair. The blood from earlier had begun to pool around their feet, the dark, viscous liquid crawling toward them as if it had a mind of its own. Their feet were heavy in it, the coldness seeping through their shoes, into their very bones. "Come on, we have to get out of here," Alex shouted, his voice raw, but his command was almost lost to the screams that filled the air. They were too loud, too powerful, too overwhelming. It was as if the house was drowning them in the voices of the dead, and there was no way out. Carlos took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. He ran toward the door, his hands trembling as he gripped the knob. He threw himself against it, slamming his shoulder into the wood. The impact sent a jolt of pain through his body, but the door didn't budge. His breath came faster, panic rising in his chest like a tidal wave. But then, finally, with a sickening crack, the door broke open. For a moment, the world beyond the house seemed like a distant memory. The once clear sky that had been a bright blue just hours ago was now consumed by dark storm clouds that roiled and churned overhead. The wind howled outside, whipping through the trees, its voice a shrill screech that seemed to match the cries inside the house. The trees in the yard were bent at strange angles, their branches twisted and contorted like skeletal fingers reaching toward the heavens. The landscape beyond the door looked alien, as though the house had somehow twisted reality itself, pulling them into another dimension, a place where time no longer made sense, and the rules of the natural world had been warped beyond recognition.
As they stepped out of the house, the ground beneath them shook, and the air grew heavier, like the weight of the world had settled on their shoulders. The house seemed to groan, its walls shuddering as though it were alive, ready to collapse around them. Every movement, every breath felt wrong. The earth beneath their feet felt unsteady, like the ground itself was trembling in fear. And then they saw him. In the distance, standing near the edge of the yard, was a figure, an old man. His appearance was almost too unreal to be believed. He was gaunt, his face pale and weathered with age, his skin sagging around his skull like it was barely clinging to his bones. His eyes were empty, hollow, like black voids staring out into the night. And then there was that smile. It wasn't a smile of warmth or familiarity. It was twisted, unnatural, the kind of grin one might expect from a predator eyeing its prey. It was the kind of smile that made their blood run cold. His teeth, yellowed and cracked, glinted in the weak moonlight as he slowly raised a hand and beckoned them forward. "Welcome to the house of death," the old man whispered. His voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something insidious in the way he spoke, a hint of malice beneath his calm exterior. The words hit them like a slap to the face. The house of death? What did that even mean? And who was this man? How long had he been there? Alex's heart pounded in his chest. His eyes locked on the old man. The fear was suffocating. Every instinct inside him screamed at him to run, to escape. But his body felt paralyzed, unable to move. Maria's breath hitched as she grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. She was shaking, too terrified to say anything, her eyes locked on the figure in the yard. The old man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. His feet made no sound on the earth beneath him, as though he were floating rather than walking. As he moved, the storm above them grew stronger, the wind whipping through the trees, making the branches shake and groan. The lightning that flashed in the distance seemed to strike closer and closer, illuminating the old man's face in jagged, stuttering bursts of light. But he didn't flinch. He just stood there, waiting, watching them with his hollow eyes. Without warning, the ground beneath them trembled again, this time more violently. It felt like the very earth was shaking, as if the world was unraveling at its seams. The house groaned louder, its ancient timbers creaking and cracking, as though they were being torn apart. The wind howled with a deafening roar, shaking the trees and rattling the very foundations of the house. Alex stumbled back, his legs buckling beneath him. As the ground seemed to give way, the air turned thick, heavy with a sense of finality. And the house behind them seemed to rise up, its walls bending and shifting, as if it were preparing to collapse upon them. Maria screamed, pulling Alex toward her, but their feet were no longer able to find solid ground. The shaking became more intense,
as if the entire world were in the midst of some cataclysmic event. The house, the yard, the sky, all of it seemed to be coming undone, dissolving into chaos. And then everything went black. There was no warning, no gradual fading of light. One moment, they were standing in the storm. The old man's chilling smile etched into their minds, and the next, nothing. It was as if they had been swallowed by darkness itself, the world around them disappearing into an impenetrable void. In that moment, Alex felt it, the weight of the house, the weight of the world, pressing down on him, suffocating him. The whispers from within the walls, the wailing voices of the lost souls. The blood that had once filled the room, it was all consuming him now. The house had claimed them, and whatever dark force had been at work within it, whatever had been holding them captive, had finally won. The last thing Alex felt before everything went completely dark was the touch of a cold, bony hand on his shoulder. The old man's presence was there, looming just behind him, his whispers now filling his ears. Welcome to the house of death. And then there was nothing. The morning light crept slowly over the horizon, casting an eerie glow on the ruins of La Casa de la Muerte. The once grand mansion now stood silent, its decaying walls standing as a grim testament to the dark history that clung to its very foundation. The air around it was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the house itself had become a vacuum, drawing in everything that dared approach. There was no sign of the three friends, Alex, Maria, and Carlos. They had vanished without a trace, their screams silenced, their fates sealed by the curse that had claimed so many before them. Their disappearance, like those who had come before them, became just another chapter in the long, tragic history of the house. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones, their faces drawn with fear and sorrow. They whispered to one another about the horrors that had occurred in La Casa de la Muerte, the evil that had seeped into the very walls of the house, binding it to the land. It was said that the house had claimed new souls, that the curse had reached out once again, dragging in the unwitting and the brave alike. No one who entered La Casa de la Muerte ever returned unchanged. If they were lucky enough to make it out alive, they were never the same, their minds shattered by what they had seen within. But for most, death was the only escape. The town had long been haunted by the stories, passed down from generation to generation, of those who had dared to explore the house and its cursed grounds. Some said it was the blood of the Larios family that had stained the house, the result of an ancient pact that had doomed them and all who came after. Others spoke of the restless spirits that wandered the halls, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to disturb their eternal slumber. There were even those who claimed that La Casa de la Muerte was no mere house, but a living entity, feeding off the fear of those who entered, trapping them in its dark embrace. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder. People began to speak of the voices, soft, barely audible at first, but growing stronger each night. They would come from deep within the house, echoing across the mountains like a warning, a plea for help that could never be answered. The voices were said to be the souls of the lost, the ones who had been consumed by the curse. Their cries reaching out to anyone who would listen. It was a constant reminder of the fate that awaited anyone foolish enough to venture too close to La Casa de la Muerte. No one, not even the bravest among them, dared to go near the house anymore. The fear was too great, the warnings too clear. The once familiar path that led to the mansion had become overgrown, nature slowly reclaiming the land, as if trying to erase the stain of the house's presence. The townspeople avoided the area, steering clear of the haunted grounds, as if the very earth around it had become cursed. Children were warned never to go near the edge of the jungle, for fear that they might stray too close and be drawn into the house's malevolent grip. But the curse did not end with the disappearance of Alex, Maria, and Carlos. It was said that the house's power extended far beyond its crumbling walls. The shadow of La Casa de la Muerte loomed over the town, its influence reaching into every corner, every home. There were rumors of strange happenings, of people experiencing unsettling dreams, of objects being moved without explanation, of eerie sounds in the dead of night. The townspeople spoke of a heavy presence that seemed to settle over the town, a lingering darkness that never quite left. It was as though the curse had spread, infecting the very air they breathed, and there was no escape from it. The house, though abandoned, still stood tall in the distance, its silhouette a constant reminder of the evil it harbored within. The broken windows still stared out across the town like hollow eyes, watching, waiting. No one ever saw anyone enter or leave the house, but the feeling of being watched never went away. The house had become a legend, a place that no one dared to approach, but whose power continued to resonate in the hearts of those who lived nearby. The bloody secrets of La Casa de la Muerte remain just that, secrets locked away within its decaying walls, too terrible for the world to know. And yet, despite the warnings, despite the horror, there were always those who were drawn to it. There were always the curious, the thrill-seekers, the skeptics who believed that they could uncover the truth, that they could be the ones to break the curse. But they, too, would be swallowed by the house, their fates sealed by the very evil they sought to understand. And when they disappeared, the town would whisper again, recounting the tale of the latest lost souls. And another chapter would be added to the long, tragic history of La Casa de la Muerte. As the years went on, the house slowly faded into the background of the town's daily life. People still spoke of it, but with a sense of resignation, as if the house was a part of the land now, a part of the town's forgotten history. The voices continued, though, still whispering in the night, a constant reminder of the curse that lived on. Some claimed they could hear the wailing of the lost souls if they listened closely enough. A soft, mournful sound carried on the wind. It was said that the house's curse could never be broken, that it would continue to claim souls as long as the earth stood. And so, La Casa de la Muerte remained, its secrets buried deep within its walls, waiting for the next unwitting victim to stumble upon it. The curse lived on, as it always would, a dark force that could never be escaped. The house, with its bloodstains and whispers, would never be forgotten, and its horrors would continue to haunt those who dared to speak its name.
The house of death would never die, and those who had entered its gates would never truly leave. They would remain there forever, trapped in the endless cycle of torment, their souls consumed by the house, and their voices, like the others, would continue to wail through the mountains of Colombia, forever warning those who came too close.